Welcome to We and Lewis, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the remarkable, creative, and energetic people who live in Lewis and are helping our community forge a collective soul as appealing as it is unique. These are their stories in their words. They are the we in Lewis. I'm your host, Kevin McGinnis. Our guest today is Paul Sparrow, the distinguished, gifted, award-winning television producer and executive. He's worked on a variety of popular television shows, authored a critically praised book entitled The Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, was the director of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and was deputy director and senior vice president of the Newseum in Washington, D.C. He has written and spoken on topics of great import, such as the future of news. He's also organized and is the moderator of the Lewis Library Fireside Chat series, as well as the singer-songwriter series he created with Ron Collins. To be honest, if Paul was the host of this podcast, we wouldn't need guests. Today's episode is brought to you by the Lewis Chamber of Commerce, which was organized in April 1975 to advance the general welfare and prosperity of the Lewis area. And it's been quite a ride this last half-century. Betsy and her team seem to have something going on every week, whether it's the British Motorcar Show, the Lewis Garden Tour, the Holiday Parade, and support of organizations both big and small like this podcast. If you can, drop by the Chamber's office at the historic Fisher Martin House at 120 Kings Highway. It doubles as a visitor center. Just don't try to use the stairs. Paul, welcome to the podcast. Be honest, we're thrilled you were able to fit us in with all you're doing. Most importantly, do you have your power back?
Yes, I do, and thanks for having me. You have a great podcast here, and I love the way you approach the subject.
Given all that you've accomplished, having lived all over the United States, gone to college and grad school in California, how did you end up here in Lewis?
Well, in 2018, when I was the director of the FDR Library up in Hyde Park, my old friend Ron Collins, who was the founder of the History Book Festival, invited me to come down for the festival to interview an author who'd written a book about Eleanor Roosevelt. And my wife and I came down, and we really were intrigued. I grew up in a town very similar to Lewis, so I was like, oh, this is really nice. We had lived in D.C. for a long time, so we'd been out to the Delaware Shore, and we knew it, but we hadn't really spent time in Lewis. And then over the next couple of years, we came down every year, and we would vacation. We would look at homes. We got a real estate agent looking around and trying to figure it out. But we couldn't find the right place, and we were looking at the town where I grew up and some other places. But then in 2022, after I'd retired, we came down for a 2-week vacation on Memorial Day, and our real estate agent showed us our dream house.
Wow.
And we wrote a check, and I just loved it. We were right on Red Mill Pond. It's beautiful, great neighbors, old neighborhood. And, Lewis has turned out to be the perfect choice.
Others have referenced that there's a feeling you get when you visit Lewis. Some have said they liked it immediately. Others that it made them feel good or welcome or mentally charged. How would you describe the attraction?
Well, we were attracted to it immediately because of the natural beauty and the ocean and the beach. Again, that's like where I grew up. But the longer I'm here, the more I realize there's a unique component to the population here. It is one of the most educated, interesting, engaged groups that I've ever been around. Almost my whole career, I've been dealing with information and storytelling, interacting with lifelong learners. And this whole community is built of lifelong learners. Everybody here is curious and wants to do something, and they volunteer. And, you're out planting tulip bulbs, and the guy next to you is a former CEO, and then so it's like, wow, okay, this is a very interesting community because it draws from Washington, Philadelphia, New York. So you get a lot of people who retire back out here. And I think it's really unique in all the places, especially small towns like this that I visited.
We like to say there's an inappropriate number of interesting people in such a small town.
Well put.
You've been creating, organizing, and moderating activities your whole life, it seems. So it's no surprise that you're still doing the same thing today. Is it in your blood?
I've always been a storyteller of sorts. I have a vivid imagination, but also I just like telling stories. And when I was in the first grade, the first day of school, the teacher said, hey, I want you all to write down a little bit about what you did over your summer vacation. So I wrote about taking a ship across the Atlantic and going to Paris and visiting the Eiffel Tower. And it was a small town. She bumped into my mom at the grocery store, and she said, oh, it sounds like you had a wonderful trip to France this summer. How did it go? And my mother says, we didn't go to France. She goes, what do you mean? Paul wrote a wonderful essay about it. And she goes, yeah, well, that's Paul. So I've always been a storyteller. And I grew up in a family of scientists, so it was always sort of expected that I would be a scientist, as all my brothers were. But, I was the creative one. I was always doing things that were sort of outside of that paradigm. And I just discovered that I get great satisfaction from telling stories. And, whether it's in music or in television or in museums, that's sort of my thing.
When moderating a fireside chat at the library, are you building upon the legacy of FDR, a legacy you obviously understand far better than most of us?
I don't know if I'm building on his legacy, but I'm trying to keep his legacy alive. I think that was a very important period in American history. I think both Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt were extraordinary and unique characters who personify sort of the very best of what makes America great. They had flaws. And so I think that there's a message we can take from that period in American history. One of the greatest crises, that we've ever experienced, both the Great Depression and World War II. And there are lessons to be learned then about the resilience of American democracy, the core character of what makes America different. And I just love what they were able to accomplish despite everything. It really is an inspiring set of stories. And, I choose them based on anniversaries sometimes on authors who have written books that I think are interesting. And I love doing talks with authors because then it gets a much more dynamic conversation. It's not just me standing up there, blah, blah, blah. Although I like that too.
In some ways, the fireside chat concept, was that sort of like the precursor to a podcast?
Well, it really was in some ways. People don't understand the power radio had during that period. I mean, commercial radio really started in the early 1920s. By 1933, March of 33, when FDR became president, there were about 30% of all American homes had radios, and by the time he died in 1945, it was 89% of American homes had radios. So it really was the primary source of mass communication. And FDR had a unique skill set around radio because he understood the difference between a speech at a convention or at a big hall or something, which were broadcast over radio, and his fireside chats. Because the fireside chats were intimate. He would envision his neighbor sitting across the kitchen table from him, and he would talk to the American public as if they were sitting across the table from him. So his voice was relaxed. He used common language. He wasn't trying to impress people. He was trying to explain things. And it made his radio speeches, his fireside chats, different than anything that people had ever heard from a politician before. And I always like to tell a story about his first act as president of the United States on March 5th, 1933, one day after the inauguration, was to close every bank in America. He called it a bank holiday, but he closed every bank in America that hadn't already closed because of the Great Depression. Matter of fact, in his inaugural address, when he uses the famous line, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he's talking about the banking crisis because people were afraid they were going to lose their money, so they would go to the bank and demanded to have their deposits returned. The run on the bank would make the bank fail, and then everybody would lose their money. So they passed an Emergency Banking Act, and then about a week later, on Sunday night, March 12th, he does his first fireside chat. The banks are going to reopen the next morning, or at least they're going to reopen in the 12 Federal Reserve cities. And he goes on the radio, 13 minutes, and says, your money will be safer in a reopened bank than it will be under your mattress. Classic sort of visual metaphor that he would use. And he explained that, there's some banks that are healthy, we're going to reopen them. Some banks are going to need help, we're going to help them. Some banks are too far gone, they're going to have to close. The next morning, no one knew what was going to happen. There were lines of people outside of the banks all across America. And he gets calls at the White House. They're waiting to see what's going to happen. When they open the doors, people are bringing their money back. They're putting their money back into the banks because of this one fireside chat. 13 minutes. And he ended the banking crisis. Nothing had fundamentally changed economically, except there was a new guy in charge. So that really got me to believe that there is a power to these fireside chats. And so that's what I'm trying to honor in the programs we do here.
So you could communicate hope.
Yes.
And in some ways, most people of our generation understand or remember or were taught the day of infamy speech, not this speech. But in some ways, it sounds like this speech may be far more important to the history of the country.
The first Fireside Chat set the tone for everything, because if he had not been able to fix the banking crisis, American democracy, American capitalism, as we know it, would have ended. Even at that point, there was 25% unemployment, and back then, in most families, only one person worked. So, it was staggering. There were millions of homeless people literally living in shacks. The Depression had been going on for over 3 years. America was on the verge of absolute collapse. There was serious conversations about whether or not American democracy would survive, particularly in light of rising fascism and totalitarianism of other countries that seemed to have a better answer to this Great Depression. So, yeah, it was an important speech.
How does one write a history about a person who has been the subject of so many books?
It was daunting. I mean, there's like 1,200 books written about FDR and Eleanor, and that doesn't even include all the World War II books in which he's a character. But I really became deeply committed to helping people understand why he was a great president, and it all comes down to words. And so the first draft of the book was really looking at all of his speeches and Eleanor's speeches, and it was called Words That Changed the World. And it was rejected by a big publisher. We took it to. Everybody was like, yeah, nobody wants to read that book, Paul. So I said, I'm going to narrow it down to what I think is the most important part of his presidency. September 1939, basically to January 1942. Germans' invasion of Poland until right after Pearl Harbor. Because when Germany invades Poland, the vast majority of Americans, 70%, did not want America to get involved in this war. Didn't even want us to support our allies, because a lot of Americans were still angry at Britain and France because they hadn't paid us back from World War I. So he had to convince the United States, had to convince the American people that it was an existential threat to America if fascism took over Europe, if totalitarianism took over Asia. So he had a task, and he was going to use his skills as a great teacher, as a great explainer, to convince America they had to do this. But there was the Neutrality Act, making it literally illegal for him to do that. Congress was adamantly opposed to any support. And the majority of Americans, and an incredibly powerful and effective speaker, emerged as his nemesis, Charles Lindbergh. Now, people don't know this story very well, but he flew across the Atlantic solo in 1927, became a huge global star. I mean, you can't imagine how famous he was. Then that fame was augmented when his young son was kidnapped and murdered, and then there was the trial of the century. I mean, Lindbergh was phenomenally famous and adored. He leaves America in 1935 to get away from the paparazzi, goes to Europe, and becomes chums with the Nazis because he thinks they make really good planes. He's also anti-Semitic. So when he returns to the United States, he becomes essentially the spokesperson for this America First movement, the anti-Churchill, pro-Hitler movement. And so FDR had to confront one of the most popular people in the world, incredibly effective speaker. He would do events where 40,000 people would show up. He would fill football stadiums, He would do radio broadcasts and millions of people would listen. So he had a really daunting opponent, and that opponent was funded by Henry Ford and William Randolph Hearst and people like that. So that was a very powerful opposition. And if you look at how he was able to persuade the American public to get ready for Pearl Harbor and then to move America into the war, it's just an incredible story.
How do you do it?
Well, he had help. And his most important ally was Winston Churchill. Because Winston Churchill provided an inspiring figure that Americans could rally behind. Remember, Churchill's in the war since September 39. We don't get in until December 41. So he's fighting this war by himself, the British Empire, for 2+ years. But his speeches inspiring the British population also sort of inspired the American population. And as more and more information came out about what Hitler was doing and the evils of totalitarianism, particularly the violence against Jews, people started saying, I know maybe we can do business with the Nazis, but do we want to do business with the Nazis? So I think that there's a real trajectory that you can look at during this period that teaches us how to communicate effectively, but more importantly, how important it is to get the American public behind you before you take radical action such as starting a war.
I think people today don't understand. You have these two warring coalitions. They're factions, if you will. Isolationism versus the involvement that Roosevelt was pushing. The isolationists were very well funded. They had newspapers on their side. You mentioned industrialists they had on their side. They had this iconic figure. Roosevelt wasn't in a position to go to a stadium and speak in front of all those people, correct?
Well, he did. Of course, they had political rallies. Remember, he had served, so he was elected wins the 32 election, wins the 36 election, greatest electoral landslide in American history. So he served 2 terms. So he's supposed to leave. But he decides after Germany sweeps across Europe in the spring of 1940 and France falls and it looks like the world is, about to end as we knew it, he makes the radical decision to run for a 3rd term, which was very controversial. Even when the Democrats, were not crazy about this idea of him running for a 3rd term. But he runs for the 3rd term because he felt like he was best qualified to lead the country forward, and the American population agreed with him. But in that campaign, he used all of those political rallies and radio broadcasts to help explain to the American public what's going on here. And he had brilliant use of language, like when he talked about the German submarines in the North Atlantic, because there was really a shooting war going on for a year in the North Atlantic before Pearl Harbor. And he talks about what's going on in the North Atlantic. And he talks about the German submarines that are sinking cargo ships as the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. And if you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you crush him. You don't wait until he's struck. And this was the way he was justifying his shoot-first philosophy for the U.S. Navy, despite the fact that we were not in war with Germany. So that's the sort of thing that you can look at and really understand how he used language to make his case and get the American public to support what he was doing.
And at that time, there was no constitutional amendment about a
Correct.
3rd term.
Correct. It was a tradition, and it was a sacred tradition started by George Washington himself. So, and back then, traditions were pretty important.
They mattered
in the political world. But I think there was a understanding by most Americans that we were facing this global crisis, and he had enormous emotional and political capital because he had pulled us out of the Great Depression. People believed he was telling them their truth. He believed they had their best interests at heart, and that's a powerful tool.
In most political battles, you try to choose your opponent. Did FDR choose Lindbergh, or was Lindbergh chosen by the president's opponents?
FDR absolutely did not choose Lindbergh and was terrified of Lindbergh as an opponent because Lindbergh was so effective and because he was so authentic. He was not a politician. As a matter of fact, the Republicans tried to get Lindbergh to run as a Republican against FDR in the 1940 election. And, of course, there's been, fictional books written about what would have happened if Lindbergh had become president. But no, as a matter of fact, when Lindbergh first came back to the United States in mid-1939, FDR invited him to the White House and turned on the charm, Matter of fact, as soon as Lindbergh walked into the Oval Office, Roosevelt, sitting behind his desk, of course, because he couldn't get up, said, my daughter and your wife went to the same school together. They knew each other, and immediately starts right in on a conversation, which is what FDR would always do to get people to relax and to distract them from the fact that he was crippled. And they had a long conversation, and that night when Lindbergh got home, he wrote in his diary that FDR was a charming conversationalist, incredibly charismatic, but I'm not sure I trust him. I don't think we can be friends. So that's sort of where they stood.
Did they ever reconcile?
No. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I don't want to give away the end of my book, but after Pearl Harbor, the isolationists and America First and Lindbergh all of a sudden found themselves in a very difficult situation. Lindbergh immediately, he had been a reserve officer in the U.S. Army Air Force that he resigned during the big battles with FDR. He went back. He tried to get his commission reinstalled. He wanted to volunteer. He was rejected by all branches of the U.S. military. He was rejected by almost every weapons manufacturing company because nobody wanted to get FDR mad at them. The only person who would hire him was Henry Ford, who hired him to manage this huge aircraft factory that he was building the B-24 bombers. And Lindbergh did an excellent job, actually, of helping improve the quality of the plane, improve their manufacturing techniques. Then towards the end of the war, he became a private contractor and went to the Pacific and was flying combat missions with the Marines, flew 50 combat missions,
Really?
Unauthorized. He was not a commissioned officer, and helped them improve the performance of these planes that they flew. The Marines were flying out there, increased their maneuverability, increased their distance, increased their firepower. So he really contributed enormously to the war. But FDR never forgave him. As a matter of fact, one senator quoted FDR as saying, I'm going to clip that young man's wings. So there was a lot of animosity there. It wasn't until after the war when President Eisenhower reinstated him, his commission, and made him a lieutenant general in what was now the U.S. Air Force. And then Lindbergh became an environmental activist and had a secret family in Germany and all sorts of crazy stuff. But you have to read the book to get that.
By the way, we got a little ahead of ourselves. Awakening the Spirit of America. FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh is a must-read. Absolutely terrific. And the plaudits you got are they had to be very satisfying.
Well, they were, and it was a work of love. But one of the things that I enjoy most is talking. So I got to travel around the country. I did 47 events, several at other presidential libraries, and I really enjoy going out there and telling the story and talking to the public and getting their questions. I particularly enjoy talking to high school students. And I talked about the book at the Savannah Book Festival. They took me out to a high school down there, and I put up a PowerPoint slide, a picture of Franklin Roosevelt, and asked a room, probably about 100 students. And these were mostly, juniors and seniors. Raise your hand if you know who this is. Not a single person in the room knew who he was. And then when I said his name, someone, yeah. And what did he do? Didn't he build the Panama Canal? I said, no, that's his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Oh, was he the guy with the Depression? Yeah, that's the guy. So there's just, as history goes on and lesson plans get compressed to deal with new history, old history falls by the wayside. And so a lot of people, young people don't know who Franklin or Eleanor Roosevelt were and what they did.
Most of us have probably heard the quote from George Santayana that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Remember kind of implies prior knowledge. Does that quote still work today?
I think more so than ever. Because we've accelerated the news cycle so much that it's hard even to keep track of what happened last week, with this fire hose of information and media and what do they call it now? Slop, the AI generated information, which is most of the time wrong or at least heavily skewed. And so there is a limit. People have a bandwidth, that they can take new information in. And so it gets harder and harder to keep track of that. And of course, a lot of Americans don't read. As soon as they finish high school, they never pick up a book again. So it's hard. This is why popular culture like movies and television shows and podcasts are so important, because that is how people consume information these days. And so it's difficult to get historical accuracy incorporated into contemporary mass media, particularly because so much of it is politically driven and inaccurate. So, if you look at history the way I do, which is where you're trying to find what are the stories that people are going to care about? How do I tell stories about people in a historical context so they learn about the history, but they're engaged through the personal stories? And luckily with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, you got a lot of great personal stories there.
One political wag I used to work with after a bitter loss suggested that American society guarantees every generation the inalienable right to make the same mistake as their predecessors. Is that too cynical?
Nope. Winston Churchill said it or succinctly, he said, you can always count on the Americans to make the right decision after they've tried everything else. So I think,
you can't, if you make up a line, you can't beat Churchill. He's always going to do it better.
Yeah. So I think that is a problem in American society, because we're a society that really sort of believes in this idea that people are good, and not go back and say, no, people are not good. People are horrible. People, there's a large percentage of every population in the history of the world where you had sociopaths and psychopaths who somehow got onto the reins of power and did terrible, terrible things. And you're right. It's a 30 to 40 year cycle around which people don't understand, as the generation that were adults during that period die out, there's nobody keeping those stories alive from a personal perspective. And that's one of the reasons you see this cycle of people forgetting about the bad mistakes they made in the past and making them again, partly because they think, well, they're going to get it right.
The world today is more interconnected than ever before. I mean, someone sitting in an attic room in the middle of Germany could impact somebody in South America. We go on and on with comparisons. Yet the issue of isolationism continues to resonate so firmly, literally around the globe. Why is that?
I think humans are tribal in nature. The way we evolved genetically, it started with, the family structure and the intimate tribe, and the tribe became the primary source of survival. And eventually tribes would merge and you got larger coordinations, and then you got sort of communities, and then eventually you got countries and empires. But the core emotional genetic bonding structure is tribal. So it's always about us versus them. And there's always a them. And with America, this became particularly ingrained into our core DNA because initially the us was us and the British Empire. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't us and the British Empire. The British Empire was them, and we were us. And we were a isolated country, oceans on both sides, deserts and forests on the north and south. So we felt this sort of security that we were safe, we were protected. And that led from the very beginning, if you look at the history of Americans' antipathy towards immigrants, I mean, even in the early 1700s, we started identifying the immigrants we liked and the immigrants we didn't like, right? And you can go through the list. We didn't like the Germans. We didn't like the Italians. We didn't like the
Irish.
Oh, we hated the Irish. We didn't like the Mexicans. We didn't like the Chinese. So every new generation, as immigrants try to come to this country to benefit from the extraordinary opportunity that America offers, you get this new wave of we don't like them because they're not us. You also have deeply entrenched racism in America. And again, globally, but it is part of the America's founding DNA because slavery was incorporated into our very founding, our very charter documents, right? The slaves were only considered 3/5 of a person when you were calculating the population of a state for political representation. So that core sense that whites are supreme and now it's us versus them happens not just on a tribal or a national level, but it also happens on this racial level. And so I think the isolationist movement in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and in the 2000s are all based on this idea that politicians can leverage that emotional us versus them for political gain.
Initially, broadcast news was not considered to be a profit opportunity or center, but an opportunity to focus on public service and prestige. Journalist Marvin Cowell always likes to recall CBS owner and chairman William Paley instructing news reporters that they shouldn't be concerned about cost. I have Jack Benny to make money. What happened?
Well, actually, it was not altruistic. The radio licenses, because radio uses the public airwaves, radio licenses were granted under the caveat that the radio stations must provide a verifiable public service. And there were annual reports that every radio station had to submit to the federal government showing what they had done to better the community. There were also very, very strict fairness rules about if you report on a political campaign and you talk to a candidate from one party, you have to give a candidate from the other party equal time on your broadcast network. So the news became one of those key elements to their public service. Some of their cultural programming became that. Broadcasting important political events or historic events became part of this need to prove that they were meeting this requirement for public service. So it was not altruistic. Now, that idea of public service, the use of the public airwaves, began to be undermined with the introduction of cable. Because cables, if you're watching television through a cable, that cable is not the public airwave. It is a private property, company-run distribution system. So all of a sudden, they started undermining this, and Ronald Reagan very effectively gutted the FCC so that the idea of the fairness doctrine, the idea of this public service, that you had to do this, was eliminated. And that led directly to the rise of talk radio, which was primarily right-wing in the early days. And then it led to Fox News and all the things that you see out there now, where all of the old Bill Paley, Edward R. Murrow, edicts about the integrity of the news division were thrown out the window because, hey, if you're part of this corporation and we're a publicly traded company, you don't make money, you're out, which is exactly what you're seeing right now.
Recently, I was talking to a man in his late 20s who shared his core belief that he and his peers don't trust any statement made by a government official. Among other things, he pointed to AI, technology or technological sophistication, the lack of accountability, and a long record of lies and political falsehoods. Is the discovery of what's true or what really happened becoming increasingly difficult?
Actually, again, you go right back to the founding of America. All of the early newspapers in American colonial society were run by political parties. They were all partisan. They were all, quote unquote, fake news because they were all pushing a political agenda. Many of them just made up stories. And this happened all the way up. Newspapers never were required to meet the public service and the fairness doctrine because they were private entities and they were not using public airwaves. So newspapers, which were the primary source of news in this country for generations, have always been partisan, have always shifted the news, have always helped their party and hurt the other party in any way they can, including just horrific lies. I mean, one of the reasons Charles Lindbergh left the country was because all of the lies being told about him and his family and the harassment that he suffered. So that's why he left. The difference now is that at least until really the 2000s, there was a gatekeeper. There were corporations that could be held accountable if they did things really bad, if you really libeled someone. So there were legal constraints about how far you could push this fabrication, these deliberate lies. As soon as the internet happened, all of a sudden anybody could say anything they wanted and put it out there, and the distribution companies were granted immunity. So Facebook, for example, I can say anything I want, and even if it's a blatant lie, and Facebook is not going to be punished for it. I might be punished for it, but Facebook won't. And the social media companies become the conduit for all this information. And so the funding services for the newspapers and television that used to be more responsible is being sucked up by these digital companies that have no responsibility to provide a public service. Their only responsibility is to maximize shareholder value. And that is the core deal with the devil that capitalism is.
I think we could spend another 8 episodes on that issue, but we're going to switch gears for a moment. What led you into television?
Well, it's a funny story. So I was a music major in college, doing electronic music, and in graduate school, I went to Mills College, and they had a big electronic music studio there. So I developed a lot of technical skills with recording in recording studios and recording in the field, recording instruments. And I was asked by another student at San Francisco State if I would help him do a documentary. So I would be the audio guy. So I said, sure, and so he was making a film about the elephant seals of Northern California, which had recently come ashore on the mainland, and the repopulation of a species that they had thought was extinct. So we get down there, we're on the beach. I'm carrying this giant Nagra reel-to-reel tape deck with headphones and a microphone stuck out on a long pole, and we're walking down the beach, and it's windy, and he's filming, and it's back in the days when the film camera is not video, and so I'm not connected to him. And all of a sudden, he starts running down the beach. I'm like, where are you going? And I turn around, there's this bull elephant seal, 6,000-pound bull elephant seal charging at us. So now I'm running down the beach, headphones flopping, microphone, and we jump up on this dune to get away from this seal who's trying to kill us. And that was my first exposure to, media production. But we went on and made the documentary. It got on television. And I discovered that being an avant-garde electronic musician did not pay well. And so I needed a job. And so I started making documentaries, first as a sound guy, then as a film editor. Then I worked at a television station as a video editor and a producer. And next thing I knew, I was a TV guy.
Were you learning how to do certain things all the time?
Oh, yeah. Every day was like, oh, God, what do I learn today? As a matter of fact, when I took the job at the TV station, it was a test, right? They had me come in at night and edit this piece for them. And I had never edited video. I had edited film. And if you understand how film is edited, you take a piece of film, you cut it, you tape another piece of film to it. It's pretty tactile. In electronic video editing, you've got the computer and you're pushing in numbers and the machines don't line up properly. And back then, every time you made an edit, you lost a frame of audio. So if you made a mistake, you had to keep going back or start all over again. And I had the manual on my lap, and I'm there all night. I'm trying to get this thing ready. But yeah, you learn as you go. And I've always been a quick learner, and I pick things up very quickly. And I also have this very annoying habit of always being sure of myself, even when I'm hopelessly wrong. But you sort of need that confidence to take on new chat. And I'm a risk taker, so I'm willing to risk things and take it on with the hope that I'll eventually figure it out and succeed. And my whole career has been like that because it's, as you pointed out, it's not exactly a linear career.
When I worked in the U.S. Senate, people would ask whether having a degree in politics was essential for success. I would always suggest that they get a degree in something else, something that provided a true skill. All you need to know about politics, you can learn by being a bartender. Is there a secret to working in television?
Thick skin, drive, willing to work incredibly long hours under terrible circumstances, and an ego that allows you to accept rejection and, 13-week contracts and shows get canceled and you're constantly, some people get lucky, they get a job on a show that runs for 20 years. Most people on television don't. So you really have to be committed to it as a technology. Television is fading, as a technology. It's not the pinnacle of our communication systems anymore. I mean, a lot of people still watch it, but more people are watching videos now through all the different platforms than are watching television. So it's not a field that I would recommend people go into at this point. I would strongly recommend them to go into journalism, into the idea of reporting in their communities, helping people get accurate and fair information. But let's face it, there are lots of other channels for that these days. And with the increased politicization of things like CBS and, the potential future for CNN, if it gets bought by the Ellisons, you never know, are these once trusted news organizations on television still going to be trusted news organizations?
You've been involved in both news and the entertainment side of television. Which is harder?
I would say news is definitely harder in the sense that there are rules and there are strictures and there is a commitment, in most news organizations to make sure you get it right. And sometimes it's really hard to get it right, particularly in a fast-changing news environment where there are people who don't want you to get it right. People who are actively trying to make you get it wrong or to miss things or to not report the news that they don't like it. What was the man, I can't remember the famous quote that news is something that someone doesn't want you to print, everything else is advertising. Which I think it's a good definition. I did some wonderful entertainment reporting when I first started in television for a TV show called Evening Magazine, sort of a Entertainment Tonight kind of show. And, I got to interview all these great musicians and performers and do restaurant reviews and have all this fun. And it was great. But as I got more and more into it as a producer, I felt that it was not fulfilling my storytelling desire. I wanted to tell stories that had meaning, that made a difference. I can remember when I worked on a documentary in San Francisco on the AIDS quilt. This was early in the AIDS epidemic. San Francisco was being devastated. They didn't even really fully understand it, and they started making this quilt in honor of all the people who had died. And I got immersed in this incredible story, in this incredible community of people, and it really made me realize the power of television to tell these important stories that honor those people who are doing something significant, and might change the way people behave. A story on Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead was a lot of fun. Didn't really change anybody's, view of the world. Trying to help people understand that AIDS victims are not horrible people, that you should have empathy and sympathy for them. That was important. So that sort of put me on the track much more that I wanted to do serious journalism.
And is that sort of sentiment what led you to DC?
It is. So I got a job working. I had been working at the magazine show in San Francisco. And I got a job working for USA Today on TV. Not 60 Minutes, but it was a news organization with a very respectable newspaper partner. And that really taught me a lot because it was a dismal failure as a TV show. And you learn more from your failures than your successes. But I also met a lot of wonderful, incredible people. It was an amazingly talented group who were brought together to do this show. And it started me on a path about trying to understand what is meaningful in television programming. And yes, you have to entertain people. Again, that's who pays the bills. But you can also look for those stories and try to get those stories through the process that have some meaning. I thought after I left USA Today on TV, I went to work for America's Most Wanted. And this was a show where you had unbelievable power, and you would put a picture up of a bad guy and the phones would start ringing, and an hour later he's in custody, and it was like, wow. You really saw the power of television and the power of community and the power of storytelling. You would tell these stories about these victims and then, ask the public to help you find the perpetrator, and they would. And that was a transformative experience for me, not only because I got to work with victims and help find abducted children, but you really understood that this technology can change the world if you make a commitment to use it properly. Now, there was some cheesy stuff we did, but still, the impact was the same in that we took bad guys off the street.
What is it about human nature, and I've found this fascinating, that people will talk to someone if they have a camera in front of their face and they think they're going on television, even though it's completely not in their interest to do so. But I mean, if you bring a camera and ask a question, they'll talk.
It's an amazing phenomenon, and part of it has to do with ego, because we all think that we're smarter than everybody else, and we're going to get this right, and we're going to make us look good. But there is a magic, seductive quality to the idea of you communicating with a large group of people, you being selected, especially in the old days when video wasn't, ubiquitous, when people didn't have video studios in their pocket, when the TV crew would show up and you'd have lights and cameras and machines and makeup and trucks, and, it was a big deal for a TV crew to show up and start talking to people. But I do think and we see it now with these influencers, and it's what's happened with TikTok and Instagram, where everybody wants to be on video, and they'll sit there in the bathroom and comb their hair, and get 100,000 likes. It's like, okay, well, that is addictive, right? That is triggering something in our brain for recognition. It's also incredibly toxic, and as we've seen, young people are particularly susceptible to it, and it can ruin people's lives. It can drive them to suicide. So that power has a very dark side.
You took a very high-profile job at the Newseum, and that mission for that museum was incredible. I mean, to increase public understanding of the importance of the free press and the First Amendment, while helping the public and news media understand one another better. it would be hard to find a more lofty goal, a more worthy goal than that. It didn't work. What happened?
Well, it was a lofty goal, and it was an incredible organization, and the public loved it. In fact, there was a smaller one that originally was in Roslyn, Virginia, and because it was so popular is when they built the big one down on Pennsylvania Avenue, right across from the National Gallery of Art. The problem was, and this was a very, very wealthy foundation, it had $1 billion. It had been formed by the people that created USA Today, the newspaper. And the short answer is they built a $500 million building with a $250 million budget. And so the finances and then they opened it right before the economic collapse of 2008. So you had a cascading set of problems here with an organization that was used to having more money than they knew what to do with, building this temple to journalism in which they had to charge admission in a city with 50 fantastic free museums. So you're immediately creating sort of a business model problem, but we had good attendance. The attendance and the admission wasn't the problem. The problem was fundraising. The organization couldn't get around the idea that you needed to raise $20 or $30 million a year by asking people for money if you're going to exist as a world-class cultural institution. And so it just became economically impossible. And it was, in my mind, it was one of the saddest days ever when they closed the doors. Almost as sad as the day when they took the First Amendment down. It had been carved in stone, 70-foot high tablet on Pennsylvania Avenue. So every time a lawmaker drove up to the Capitol, they drove past the words of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. So, yeah, that was a sad day.
And you went from there to the FDR Library?
Yeah, that was a great transition for me. So I left before the museum closed because it was sort of obvious what was happening. I'd lost a political battle internally. So I was looking, I knew I had one more job in me. And when I saw the job opening for FDR Library, I just immediately knew this is like the perfect job for me. And I had worked with the National Archives because they were literally right across the street from us in Washington. We had done programs with them. And I knew that this was a job that I could really bring a lot of skills to. And it was the greatest job I ever had. I just loved it. Not only is it a fantastic facility, the Presidential Library is right near the home he grew up in. So there's the National Historic Site there for his home. Nearby, there's Eleanor Roosevelt's home, which is also a National Historic Site. The library itself was the first presidential library built by the federal government. And it really is, when you go through those archives and you hold, I can remember, I'm getting chills right now. The first time I held, the Day of Infamy speech with his handwritten changes. The first sentence in the original version was, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in world history. And he crosses out world history and writes in infamy. I mean, one of the greatest edits of all time, right? And this was the paper that he had held and written with. And when you see these things and you really help tell those stories, you feel like you're a part of it. And particularly, his office, he was the only sitting president to have a presidential library because he started building it at the end of his second term, figuring he was going home. And so you realize that, that room right there, Winston Churchill sat in that chair, Madam Chiang Kai-shek was in there, this is where they decided they were going to bomb Pearl Harbor, bomb Tokyo. You realize that history is alive in these facilities. And I do think for students particularly, seeing it and being it, and when you bring these things out and they say, is this real or is this fake, right? It's always you want to know, especially with documents and is this real? Yes, this is real. Like his crutches or his steel leg braces, when they see them, he had to wear those on his legs. Yeah, he was paralyzed from the waist down. And he was president? Yeah, he was president. So those are the things that really, I think, inspire people to learn more about history. And they're vitally important. As our education specialist at the library used to say, my job is just to plant the seed and get them interested in something, and then they have to nurture it and let it grow. And for some kids, they get exposed to it, and then for the rest of their life, they're history buffs.
But did this job give you an opportunity, or the license, if you will, to have the big thoughts, to take on a topic like the speech you gave on the future of news? I mean, there's got to be some sort for you, given your interest and given your passions, that's kind of liberating.
It's very liberating. There's also a responsibility to understand the voice of the institution. But one of the things that the FDR Library had always been pretty good at, because of the family support, was it's a warts and all institution, And so one of the things we did that was somewhat controversial is we did a big exhibit about the Japanese incarceration, using the photographs that were taken by Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams and people like that to really expose. Here was one of the great civil libertarians, one of the most liberal progressive presidents in American history, whose wife was the champion of human rights, incarcerating 120,000 people of Japanese American descent, 80,000 of whom were American citizens. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy, a travesty, and a gross violation of their constitutional rights. So it goes to show what happens when people panic and national security starts trumping our human rights. And again, one of the stories that I thought was so fascinating about this was, there was intense political pressure on FDR to sign this Executive Order 9066 to allow the military to move these Japanese citizens from the West Coast. And the person who was pushing the strongest for this, putting the most pressure on FDR, was the Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, who, of course, went on to become one of the great Supreme Court justices fighting for civil rights in the 50s and 60s, right? And who was the man who was most opposed to the incarceration of these Japanese Americans? J. Edgar Hoover, the great violator of civil rights, because his mind, the FBI, we arrested all the Japanese spies as soon as they bombed Pearl Harbor. These people are all innocent. Matter of fact, they're so devoted to America that the Japanese intelligence communities won't even try to recruit them. They recruit greedy Americans. So you get this complete upside down, sense of who supported it and who opposed it, and it really reveals a lot about America. We did a big exhibit on the Holocaust. We had an international conference about the Holocaust. It's very controversial. Many people feel FDR didn't do enough to stop the Holocaust. There's a lot of misinformation. FDR abandoned the Jews. And so telling that story and engaging with the Jewish community to help them understand the circumstances, because of course at the end of World War II, FDR was the great hero. In many Jewish homes, he was, his picture was on the wall because he was considered the great savior. It was only later in the 70s that people started saying, well, he could have done more. He should have bombed Auschwitz. He should have done this. And of course, you can debate all of those things. Yes, from a moral point of view, more should have been done. But the reality was, by the time American troops were on the ground after D-Day in Europe and got in Italy and got close enough to actually fly a plane to bomb Auschwitz, the Holocaust was essentially over. 5.5 million Jews had already been killed. So there's the horror of it and the pain that says, why didn't you do more? And then there's the reality of, well, what would you have had us do? But I do think that a platform like that does give you an opportunity to tell big, important stories.
Final question. Paul, is there a book in the works?
There is, and it's a book about an Episcopal priest that I knew growing up, and how he inspired me and many other young people in our community during the height of the 60s cultural upheavals, the civil rights, the Vietnam War. Because again, his words, like Franklin Roosevelt's, were really about what are our core values. And he has the added power of saying, well, this is what Jesus taught, help the poor, help immigrants, love thy neighbor as thyself. And yet Christianity has now been taken over by people for whom those core teachings are no longer respected.
Paul, thank you for being a guest with us today. It's been an honor to have someone who has accomplished so much in a life to take the time to talk with us. And both Steve and I are very grateful that your professional standards aren't quite as strict as they used to be. Lewis is fortunate that people such as yourself, who are still thinking about the great issues of the day, still questioning, teaching, and sharing, are here with us. I sometimes think Lewis is a town with its own faculty, some of which is housed at the Lewis Library.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and you asked great questions.
Thank you. Thanks to today's sponsor, the Lewis Chamber of Commerce. Betsy and her team always have something new in the works to put Lewis in a better light. And thanks to you for listening. I believe our recent ice age is coming to an end, although not a moment too soon. That was brutal on people, trees, and pets. Spring is coming. If you visit the beach, you can actually see sand again. Until next time, from a recording studio in the beautiful and beloved Kindle restaurant, this has been We and Lewis, the podcast. See you on the streets.